Welcome back to A Foggy Day on Olympus, everybody. My name is Coel Campo, and this is the second episode in our major new series on the end of the early church and the start of the Middle Ages.
Indeed it is, and today we're looking at clashes of church and state, late Roman style. My name's Mike Pierce, by the way.
Yeah, never mind your name. Why the dashes between church and state? Hadn't they just kissed and made up when Constantine decided to stop persecuting Christianity in 313?
Well, yes, but within a very few years, Constantine and then his successors aimed to control the church and to use it as an instrument of state. And most of the church leaders were so ecstatic and no longer being persecuted and now having a real status that they started to change their rhetoric and eventually, as we will see, their beliefs and practices accordingly.
Okay, right. Last time we looked at the start of that process. So do go back and take a look at that if you haven't already seen that.
Yes. And in the meantime, here's a lightning fast overview of the whole process.
Which it's the business of the series to explain.
It's the business of this series to explain. Now, we did see this last week, but this is a bit of repetition because obviously we're going to have people seeing one episode but not another, or the other but not the one. And so this is absolutely core information that people are going to need to understand anything that's going on in any of the episodes. So this is, in a nutshell, the 4th century revolution. Up to 311, Christianity is suffering the worst of the Roman persecutions in the early 4th century. It's been persecuted for 250 years, but the stuff at the end of that period is the worst. And from 313, the Edict of Milan, issued by Constantine, declares religious toleration, and that's really just aimed at Christianity because it's the only major religion being persecuted. And Christianity actually wins imperial favour from then on. And so during the following 67 years, 313 to 380, legal and social pressures favouring Christianity led to a massive influx of people into the churches. And at the end of it, in 380, Theodosius, who we're going to come to shortly, outlawed pagan sacrifices, and although it was still possible thereafter not to be a Christian, it became extremely difficult.
Sorry, last week I thought we said that it was up until 386, not 380.
Big mistake, sorry. 380 is correct. So far, at the time of recording this, nobody has put rude remarks to that effect in the comments section, but maybe now they will, now they've heard this, which is cheating. But anyway, yeah, it's 380. And by century's end, Christianity had, in effect, become the official and nearly compulsory religion. And that is a huge change, which is accompanied by a revolution in Christian theology, which, although we're going very light on all that, this episode and indeed the last one, that's going to be very important in the rest of this series. So here's a couple of books people can be going on with. These are both absolutely superb. The first is The Church in Ancient Society by Henry Chadwick. Now, I think I've probably had cause to mention his brother in previous episodes. There are these two brothers, both church historians, Owen of modern times and Henry concerning the early church. And they were both superb. They both lived to be really old. Henry died at 88 and Owen at 99. Anyway, this is one of Henry Chadwick's most important books. And the other book is by Mark Edwards, Religions of the Constantinian Empire. That's much more recent, just the last few years that's come out.
Yeah, and how cheap are these exactly?
Well, the second one is only about $30 ish, but the first one is $120 in paperback. It is very thick. It's maybe 700 or 800 pages worth, but yeah, it's kind of expensive, but worth it, I feel.
Yes, and
So,
you're not receiving any commission from these people.
no, I'm not. I wish I were. Although I don't suppose I would get too much at these prices. My goodness. Okay, well, here's a little backwards glance at some material that probably should have gone into last week's episode. This is just some of Constantine's Christian influenced laws. So in 316, the branding of convicts on the face was banned, quote, that the face which is formed in the likeness of the heavenly beauty may not be disfigured. And that seems to reflect perhaps not a very theologically well informed version of the belief that people are created in the image of God. In 318, Constantine decreed that civil lawsuits could, if both parties agreed, be given to the jurisdiction of a bishop whose ruling would be binding. And that's the first civil jurisdiction given to clergy. And of course, these are guys who just a few years before, well under a decade before, were being persecuted and many of them killed.
Right, so we've got secular authority being given to bishops. It sounds like the Middle Ages have already started.
Yeah, getting off to a very early start there, yes. Although we will see through the rest of this series, there's quite a lot more to go in that general direction. But yes, it's starting early. In 320, he repealed the legal disabilities which Emperor Augustus, several centuries before, had placed on celibates and childless couples.
Now, how does that reflect a Christian influence?
Well, almost all pre modern societies, and certainly including the Roman Empire, had a vested interest in everybody getting married and then breeding like rabbits, right, to keep the population up and to keep the potential supply of soldiers up for the future. Right. Also, at the personal or family level, it was seen as a kind of a duty in any case to maintain the family name, keep the family line going, that sort of thing. But, and this is something we'll say much more about next week, Christians had taken the view from fairly early on that although that was all just fine and good, it was precisely because God did care about everybody, regardless of their social status. It was okay not to marry. You weren't a second class human being by virtue of being single. And indeed, there were some practical advantages, the kind of thing that Paul outlines in 1 Corinthians chapter 7, that you're more free to serve God. Obviously, single people have rather more freedom with their time than married people do, and much more free time than parents do. Is this not so, Mrs. Camper?
Yes, I have no idea what you're referring to.
So that's what's being reflected there. The distinctive Christian belief, which is starting to get a little inflated, as we'll see next week, that that's okay. So it's kind of catering to them. And in 321, law courts and urban workers were ordered not to work on, quote, the days celebrated by the veneration of the sun, S-U-N. And this is another one of these cases where Constantine is conflating Christianity and his father's religion, which was Mithraism, the worship of the sun god. Right. But we discussed last week how Constantine is, well, he's certainly not stupid and confused. This is a deliberate conflation on his part here.
And the Christians didn't have a problem with this?
Well, no, as we find to this day, particularly amongst the sort of strict Sabbatarian types. Right? Well, what we're saying here will, of course, obviously upset them. Anyway, this is the trouble with history. It upsets every single apple cart. Yes, even yours and mine. So,
What if I don't have a lot of apples in my cart?
Okay. Well, that's a blessing under the present circumstances. All right, let's take a look here just to put ourselves in mind of who the emperors are after Julian the Apostate in the early 360s, which was as far as we got last week. So, a glance ahead here at this chart.
Now, the actual situation was an awful lot more complicated than we're giving out here, right?
Yes, it was. This is an incredibly stripped down and simplified version because for large periods of time, the Roman Empire was governed in two halves, east and west, and had been since 286. Although Theodosius was the last emperor actually to rule over the whole thing. But then it's even more complicated than that because there are co emperors in both East and West and so on. So we're simply focusing here on the most important figures. So this is both necessary and misleading, right? So Jovian is born in Singidunum or Belgrade to us these days and is emperor for just about 8 months right after Julian has died. Remember that Julian had been an apostate from Christianity. He said when he became fully emperor that he'd only ever pretended to be to keep himself alive from his murderous cousins. And he was in fact a pagan, and he started disprivileging Christianity, but that didn't last very long because he only reigned for 2 years. So Jovian then reverses the reversal, but he in fact practiced religious toleration. So it's merely a question of which religion is going to be favoured by the state rather than really seriously imposed. He's succeeded by Valentinian in 364, and he reigns for 11 years. He's born in Kibale in Vinkovci, which is just up the road from where I'm sitting right now in Osijek. He seems to have been a bit of a boorish type of person. One modern historian describes him this way. He says he was of a violent and brutal temper and not only uncultivated himself, but hostile to cultivated persons. Any similarity to current politicians alive or dead is entirely accidental. Right. Valens is in charge for some of the same time, also born in Kibale. He was an Arian, which is a kind of Christian heretic, denying the deity of Christ. We've mentioned that in passing. We'll say a lot more about that in the last episode in this series. But he was very mild in his religious policies. The most important of the late 4th century emperors is Theodosius, of whom much more in a few minutes, born in Mediolanum in Milan, and he is emperor from 379 to 395, and he's succeeded by his two sons, Arcadius, who's born in Spain but reigns in the east in Constantinople, and Honorius, who's born in Constantinople but reigns in the west. Okay, and just to get an idea where at least some of these places are, this shows the central area of the Roman Empire in the 4th century, and you can see the red line heading south there is the dividing line between Eastern Empire and Western Empire, which has got ongoing consequences and has done ever since. And just zooming in a little closer here, you can see Singidunum just in that little bulge of the west into the east there, just where it meets, in Sirmium, Sremska Mitrovica in today's terminology, and Kibale just a little to the left of that, and a fraction of an inch above it is Mursa, Mursa, which is nearly the same as Osijek today. So, except that Mursa is at the opposite end of Osijek town from me. So that was the Roman settlement.
You're really enjoying pointing out how everything comes back to the Balkans, aren't you?
Well, maybe just a bit. Anyway, it does. This was the middle of the empire, and loads of emperors were born around here or reigned around here, or their capital was in Sirmium, Sremska Mitrovica, and so on. And you see that vertical red line right there. that still has decisive effects today. That's not exactly, but roughly the borderline between the areas that in the long run would become the Catholic West and the Orthodox East, with differing alphabets, differing dominant religions, and differing mindsets, which even in a secular age persist to this day. So, yeah, this is the cockpit of the world, or at least of this end of the Eurasian landmass, right here.
What I'm hearing is if you wanted to start an empire in your own name, somebody would probably go right about to where you're sitting.
Yes, yes, but I think my empire building days are all gone now. I'm just looking for a quiet life. All right, well, we're going to look at two major state church clashes. But before we even get to that, let's look at one of the more important popes from this period, Pope Damasus, so we can see the kind of direction that things are moving. So he's born around 305, lives to 384, and is pope with effect from 366. And really, he gets his position in a rather disgraceful manner. In the city of Rome in 366, there are two rivals for the bishopric, Ursinus and himself, and they both formed private armies who fought each other in the streets with heavy loss of life. And Damasus is the victor, and he's known whilst Pope for his lavish entertainments. One report I have read from a historian picking up on a phrase used by a contemporary is he was referred to by some people as the ladies' ear tickler. So he seems to have swanned around with high society ladies, not necessarily doing anything sexually inappropriate, but at least getting their favours for financial endowments and things like that. Henry Chadwick, whom we mentioned a few moments ago, the historian, thinks that it was the achievement of Damasus to fuse the old Roman civic and imperial pride with Christianity. Now, of course, that's kind of ironic because Christianity had set itself against that old Roman civic and imperial pride. The rich adornment which Damasus lavished on martyrs' shrines and the stress on the founding apostles, Peter and Paul, asserted a claim that the real glory of Rome was not pagan, but Christian. He remarked that although the East sent the apostles, yet because of the merits of their martyrdom, Rome has acquired a superior right to claim them as citizens. And it's characteristic that Damasus is the first known pope to speak of Rome as the apostolic see, the bishopric of the apostles. And of course, that phrase has been used right down to the present.
So, when do bishops of Rome start being called pope?
Short answer is in the mid 5th century, so almost 100 years later under Leo I.
So, Damasus is listed as pope retrospectively.
Yes. In the early centuries, one referred to one's own bishop as Papa, father, of course, which many people still do when addressing a Catholic or an Orthodox priest, right? But if you're speaking about someone else's bishop, you address them simply as bishop. Only your bishop was Papa. But from the time of Leo I in the mid 5th century, the bishops of Rome start demanding to be addressed as Papa without qualification by all Christians. So that is in itself a claim to senior authority over them all.
Now, the early stages of the emergence of hierarchy we discussed at the end of episode 5 of our series on the early church.
Right, and there's going to be a link to it here. Okay, so let's look at one of our major protagonists here. This is Theodosius, who, as we said a few moments ago, was emperor from 379 to 395. He became emperor in a rather dangerous moment. The Romans had just been defeated in a very important battle, the Battle of Adrianople. Now, that battle and the lead up to it is described in this book, which is short and cheap and probably only about 10 or 15 bucks. I quickly want to say, in Alessandro Barbero's short book, The Battle of Adrianople in 378. Adrianople is in Turkey today. So the tiny little bit of Turkey that today is on the European side, right there, Thrace. The Romans were defeated by the Goths. And in the war as a whole, from 376 to 382, the Romans did no better than merely contain the Goths in Thrace. That was all they could manage to do.
So now is probably a good time to remind us who the Goths were.
Well, the Goths were a Germanic barbarian tribe. They had been, in a sense, superficially Christianized, but to Arian heretical Christianity. That's because the main preacher to them and translator of scriptures and texts and so on into Gothic was a chap called Ulfilas, who was an Arian. Now, the Goths would have a fantastic future ahead of them, at least for a while. At this stage, they're just pouring into the southeastern Balkans, into the area that is nowadays Bulgaria, and as we saw, also into Thrace. But they would go on into Italy and Spain. They had a big future over the next couple of centuries. Yes. So it's in the aftermath of that defeat in which Valens was killed in the battle, the Roman emperor. So Theodosius is then appointed. Well, here's some key points in his biography. He's born in Spain to a senior military family. The Gothic War we just mentioned there. And after the death of the Eastern Emperor Valens at Adrianople, he's made emperor by a council at Sirmium, Sremska Mitrovica, today in northern Serbia, in January 379. And during his reign, he had to fight 2 civil wars against different pretenders to the throne. He summoned the Council of Constantinople, of which more in a minute, another church council, to decide on doctrinal matters and a few other things. There was some vandalism of some pagan shrines and temples during his reign, but mostly not ordered by him, generally by Christian zealots on the ground, or hooligans, Christian hooligans. He did try, as we'll see in a moment, to make Christianity the official religion of the Roman Empire, but in practice he was fairly tolerant. And as we mentioned a moment ago, he was the last emperor of a united empire.
Right, because the empire was increasingly being governed in 2 halves.
Yes, after his time, it always would be. In fact, not long after his time, the Western Empire would start to collapse really, really seriously. But that's taking us much further than we can go today. Well, here is the Edict of Thessalonica of 380, which essentially is making Christianity the official religion of the empire. And not just Christianity generically, but Nicene Christianity, Orthodox Christianity. It's rejecting Arianism. So this is one of his decrees. It's our desire that all the various nations which are subject to our clemency and moderation should continue to profess that religion which was delivered to the Romans by the divine apostle Peter, as it has been preserved by faithful tradition, and which is now professed by the Pontiff Damasus, there he is, and by Peter, Bishop of Alexandria, a man of apostolic holiness. According to the apostolic teaching and the doctrine of the gospel, let us believe in the one deity of the Father and of the Son and of the Holy Spirit, in equal majesty and in a holy Trinity. We order the followers of this law to embrace the name of Catholic Christians.
Now, this doesn't mean quite what Catholic in our sense of Roman Catholic means.
Well, the meaning is mutating in that direction. It still just about means all embracing or the majority, like the way we might use Catholic with a small c today. But that's the direction that it's going. But as for the others, since in our judgment they are foolish madmen, we decree that they shall be branded with the ignominious name of heretics, and shall not presume to give to their conventicles, conventicles means illegal religious meetings, the name of churches. They will suffer in the first place the chastisement of the divine condemnation, and in the second the punishment of our authority, which, in accordance with the will of heaven, we shall decide to inflict.
Now, this all sounds very draconian, but it wasn't really as bad as it sounds, right?
No, it wasn't. It does sound very bad, right? But no pre-modern society actually had the ability consistently to enforce laws, and everybody understood this. This is simply indicating a general direction. Now, we see that when the boot had been on the other foot, and it was the Christians who were illegal for 250 years, right? There were some ferocious outbursts of persecution. But if that had been consistently applied, it would have been impossible for the Christians to move from being a few hundred people to being, well, even at a conservative estimate, 5% of the whole population, maybe as much as 15% of the population, by the time the persecution stopped 250 years later. Couldn't have happened, right? The explanation is that most governments didn't have a policy. The Roman Empire did have such a thing as policies sometimes, but even they couldn't really enforce them uniformly. Now, if that seems a bit hard to understand, just look at lots of third world countries today where there's a law that says one thing and what people actually do is completely different, right? The ability to enforce policy and push it right the way through simply isn't there. Okay, well, the following year, Theodosius summons the First Council of Constantinople. Now, in the last episode, we saw that this is a very significant fact when Constantine is the one, not church leaders, Constantine, summoning the Council of Nicaea. And here's Theodosius repeating the trick, 56 years later. It added to the Creed of Nicaea articles on the deity of the Holy Spirit, the church, baptism, and the resurrection of the dead. And in other respects, simply reaffirms what's decided at Nicaea and in condemning Arianism. Well, we need to think, how intolerant is Theodosius's reign? One recent historian, current historian actually, a Dutch guy, Jan Bremer, points out that religious violence in late antiquity is mostly restricted to violent rhetoric. In antiquity, not all religious violence was that religious, and not all religious violence was that violent. Right. So there's a lot of people mouthing off about what they'd like to do without that actually being transferred into really serious mistreatment of people. Sometimes it could be, mostly it wasn't. Nevertheless, that doesn't mean that Theodosius isn't doing anything at all. He is doing stuff. So he expelled Demophilus, Archbishop of Constantinople, and other Arian bishops in the east in favour of Nicene orthodoxy.
So this dispute over Arianism was no small affair. I mean, it was really pretty persistent, it seems.
Yes, and it would be for quite a long time afterwards. Right? It wasn't just a case of, the council has decided that's the end of the matter. That doesn't settle an awful lot at all, right? There's arm wrestling going on about this kind of stuff for a couple of centuries. Now, some of the pagan altars had been taken down during the previous decades, and Theodosius came under some pressure from the West, particularly from the city of Rome, to restore them, and he refused to do that, which caused discontent in the West, where adherence to the Roman gods remained strong, like I say, particularly in the city of Rome, and particularly amongst the aristocrats there. And he also insisted that pagan holidays be abolished. So this is like slow pressure. But even in passing those measures, he's recognising that not everybody's falling into line with his decree that everybody should be a Nicene Christian. They're just not. Otherwise, why would you need to pass these measures? Right? And there are frequent bouts of vandalism against pagan shrines, but those are mostly coming from local zealots. You and I were in Polish, a couple of times actually, and right at the end of the little peninsula in town there's the remains of a pagan temple, and it had been knocked down, taken apart, basically during this period, right? So it's local action. Well, the Serapeum, the Temple of Serapis in Alexandria, is a much more major case in point than that little temple in Parentium, Polish. In 391, it was destroyed by local zealots, although Roman soldiers did complete the job, let us say. Well, Theodosius would at least put out some consolatory measures to remaining pagans, most famously appointing Symmachus and one other Roman pagan patrician to be consuls in Rome. Symmachus was the last pagan consul and appointed by Theodosius. So we've got what is thought to be a portrayal of him here. He was an absolutely typical kind of Roman conservative. He saw his society and his culture changing all around him and slowly going over to this new religion, and he didn't like it. It was undermining the Roman way of life. It was incurring the displeasure of the Roman gods. It would probably lead to the demise of Rome, and had he lived long enough, he might well have said, "Told you so," because in view of the barbarian invasions, right? But here he is, kind of pleading for tolerance. We gaze up at the same stars. The sky covers us all. The same universe encompasses us. Does it matter what practical system we adopt in our search for the truth? The heart of so great a mystery cannot be reached by following one road only. So he's basically pleading for tolerance here. And this is absolutely remarkable. It's a very consistent human trait. Those who are on the thick end of authority at any given time tend to plead for tolerance. And if at some future point they gain the levers of the power, they reverse their arguments and attempt to impose their own values or their own ideas. And those who've then been ousted end up pleading for tolerance. And I've seen this happen during my own lifetime, with the people that with this kind of cultural revolution in the 1960s and 70s, pleading constantly for tolerance, and they've been in charge for a while now, and boy are they intolerant. Conservative-minded people who wanted to resist the changes of the 60s and 70s, and now those who are piping up for free speech and a little tolerance. And this is very consistent across history. The equivalents of Symmachus in an earlier age would have been all for persecuting the Christians.
Well, it's a good job that you're not at all cynical then now, isn't it?
Yes, it really is very fortunate that I'm completely and entirely uncontaminated by cynicism. Shut up!
And obviously very tolerant, as we can see.
Yes, I'm very, very, extremely tolerant.
You did invite me.
Yeah, I can't remember why now. Oh, I forget. Okay, well, let's come to our other major protagonist here, and this is Ambrose of Milan. Born sometime around 339, dies in 397, so around 58 years old. And here is one particular portrait of him, although, of course, being painted more than 1,000 years later, there is no particular reason to believe that he looked anything like this. For his political interventions, though, Ambrose is often considered to be the first medieval churchman. Now, this particular painting is by Vivarini in 1503, and I think you don't remember it, but you have actually been nose to nose with this thing. It's in the Church of Santa Maria Gloriosa dei Frari in Venice. But you don't remember it, do you?
Yes, and I'm going to claim the excuse of something that any other former EMWers will know as Pierce pace, which means that we moved at such a lightning's fast speed throughout the entire Balkans. I'm not sure how you expect us to remember any of it.
Are you complaining that you got value for money? I see. Okay, noted. Ha. Okay, so here's a key point of his biography. He's born in Trier, which is just inside Germany, and beautiful city. Some Roman remains there to this day. Born around 339, but his father died when Ambrose was young. And so his mother and his siblings and he decamped to the city of Rome. He got a solid education there. And in 372, when he will have been around 33, he was made provincial governor of northern Italy, based in Milan, which had been capital of the West since 286.
So the city of Rome was already in decline even before the barbarian invasions?
Yes, it was. And the population of the city is going down, and the centre of political gravity is moving to Milan in the west. And of course, there's the new capital built in the east, Constantinople. So, yeah, that is already happening. Okay, in 374, he became Bishop of Milan, even though he's the provincial governor, by public acclamation. The previous bishop had died, and so there was a kind of like public discussion of who's going to be the next bishop, and the crowd just started chanting for Ambrose. And now, at that point, he wasn't ordained. He hadn't been trained in theology. He wasn't even baptized, although he was a Christian. And so he was rapidly processed, so to speak. He was baptized and then ordained within the week, and then consecrated as bishop.
Now, regardless of popular support, I mean, this is reducing becoming a church leader to a mere formal process, and politics are in charge. And the fact that Ambrose himself actually turned out to be pretty good was simply good luck.
Yeah, it was. Yeah, that's exactly what's happening. But something similar is happening with people generally coming into the churches. So from around 100 AD, so right on through the second and third and early fourth centuries, people went through the catechumenate as part of a process of conversion, changing their lives, changing their beliefs. And then they were baptized, and then they were part of the church. Well, that is becoming a load of old rigmarole. You just go through it as a sort of formal process to go in. So this, what's happening to Ambrose is basically just that, only happening on steroids, so to speak. Yeah, that is what's happening during this period. People are not necessarily meaningfully being converted. Well, he studied theology under an elder. He learned Greek. He read the church fathers, and he became an accomplished preacher, a very strong rhetorician, it has to be said. Now, this is very important. We'll simply note the fact now. He is not necessarily directly instrumental, but he's certainly influential in the conversion of Augustine, who will have an even bigger impact on the long run of the church in the West. Right. But much more about that next week. So his first real big clash with secular authority is with the Empress Justina. She was an Arian and favoured the Arian constituency. Actually, Ambrose's own predecessor as Bishop of Milan had been an Arian, and they were particularly strong amongst the Goths who were serving in the Roman army based in and around Milan. Soldiers are a dangerous constituency to alienate, and Justina was on their side. But Ambrose refused even to allow them to use any of the church buildings in the city. Now, Justina was the widow of Valentinian I, who was in our little table that we looked at a few minutes ago. She was mother-in-law of Theodosius, and from 383 regent for her young son, Valentinian II.
Now, Valentinian II wasn't included in our list of emperors earlier.
No, he's an example of some of the people quite a number of people that we left out just for the sake of simplicity. He's a kind of co-emperor in the West, as his elder brother had been before him, who had then died. He's only about 12 or 13 years old, something like that. So Justina is acting as regent for him. So Ambrose is simply saying no to secular authority. And he tells Justina, if you demand my person, I'm ready to submit, carry me to prison or to death. I will not resist, but I will never betray the Church of Christ. I will not call upon the people to help me. I will die at the foot of the altar rather than desert it. The tumult of the people I will not encourage, but God alone can appease it. So he's well aware that he's got public support on his side. And in the end, Justina and her son backed down. There were actually two run-ins of this sort, and they both ended the same way. Justina and Valentinian backed down almost certainly because, in fact, they feared tumult by Ambrose's supporters, even though he wanted to stress that he wasn't going to encourage that. But it was a fair prediction that could happen. Well, the second such clash is with Theodosius, and it was the result of a massacre in Thessalonica in 390. What had happened in the city was that a Roman general, Butheric, if that name doesn't sound very Latin to you, he was in fact a Goth, but a general in the Roman army. He was lynched by a mob in the city for arresting a popular charioteer. Now, this whole disaster was a case of things just getting out of hand. I mean, there have been cases in modern times where two angry mobs have come together and started shouting at one another, and then somebody somewhere gets nervy and pulls a trigger, and the next thing, all hell breaks loose. It's one of those kind of situations. The charioteer actually absolutely should have been arrested. He had perpetrated homosexual rape on someone, and Butheric had got hold of him. But he was popular with the mob, and so they lynched Butheric and killed him. And in response, Theodosius ordered a general punishment of the citizenry, and there was a massacre. So Ambrose, again, asserts the authority of the church over secular rulers and insists essentially that Theodosius repent publicly before he can be readmitted to communion in church. And Ambrose sends a very ironic letter to Theodosius explaining the ins and outs of this, but making it absolutely plain that that is what's going to happen and what's got to happen. Now, we've got here this painting from the 17th century, which is showing Ambrose blocking the cathedral door, refusing Theodosius entry. Now, that almost certainly did not happen. The events in this whole hoo-ha weren't properly recorded until the following century by several different historians, and one of them is Theodoret, and he seems to have exaggerated what happened in response. Maybe because he wanted to emphasize how powerful and great a man Ambrose was to be able to do such a thing to an emperor, or perhaps he was talking up the power and authority of the church generally. So this painting here from the early 17th century is showing something that almost certainly didn't happen, but nevertheless, a milder version of that did happen. So there's a church-state clash, or two church-state clashes, between Ambrose and Justina and Ambrose and Theodosius, and in both cases, the church wins. And we're going to come now to some other clashes where the representative of the church loses. And that entails this man, John Chrysostom. And you've got his dates here. He lives to be about 60. He is hugely important to this day in the Eastern Orthodox Church. there isn't really anybody in Eastern Orthodoxy with the same overpowering stature over theology and the way that people think as Augustine has in the West. But if there's anybody in the East who even approaches that, it would be John Chrysostom.
Yeah, and his name literally means silver tongue, doesn't it?
Yes, because he was an absolutely brilliant preacher. And even to this day, even though obviously they've been translated into English and many other languages, just reading them, you can sense the power in his sermons. He really was a brilliant preacher. Well, here are some key points from his biography. He was born in Antioch, which had been the third city of the Roman Empire. So Rome first, then Alexandria in Egypt, then Antioch. But after the creation of Constantinople, it's bumped down one. So it's Rome, then Constantinople, then Alexandria, then Antioch. He was baptized sometime in his 20s. Remember that infant baptism, even though it's a rising tide, certainly isn't the norm, even at this point. He became a lawyer, but then went on to study theology, and he became a hermit around 375 when he would have been in his late 20s. He was very ascetic throughout his life. He's ordained a presbyter in the late 380s and becomes a powerful preacher in Antioch from then until the late 390s. What was remarkable about his preaching was he's giving practical, non-allegorical commentary on biblical passages. Now, rather a lot, particularly of the more intellectual type of priests and preachers, tended to overuse allegory and even to insist upon it as a method, perhaps following Origen. But his stuff was very practical, that ordinary people could understand and apply. So successful was he that in 397 he was appointed Archbishop of Constantinople, and he actually had to be smuggled out of Antioch because he and people around him were afraid that there'd be rioting from the populace when they realized that they were going to lose him to this Neapolis city that they all hated several hundred miles away. So he becomes Archbishop of Constantinople, and he was very successful there, again with ordinary people, for the same reasons that he had been in Antioch. But in 403, so just 6 years later, he was deposed and banished on imperial orders. He had been annoying the Emperor Arcadius and his wife Eudoxia, but there seems to have been a whole load of political machinations going on against him by Alexandria. But he was almost immediately reinstated because there was an earthquake around the time he was arrested, and many people took this as an indication of divine displeasure. And there was rioting in his support, so he was brought back again. But shortly after, he was deposed and banished again and died in 407 in Pontus, which is in what we'd now call northern Turkey. Well, he was famous for preaching care for the poor and against the misuse of wealth. And here's a classic example of it. Do you wish to honour the body of Christ? Almost certainly he's referring there to the communion bread representing the body of Christ. Do not ignore him when he is naked. Do not pay him homage in the temple clad in silk, only then to neglect him outside where he's cold and ill-clad. He's playing on the idea that all Christians are the body of Christ, right? And so you go and see your brother outside who is desperately poor. He who said, "This is my body," is the same who said, "You saw me hungry and you gave me no food. And whatever you did to the least of my brothers, you did also to me." What good is it if the Eucharistic table is overloaded with golden chalices when your brother is dying of hunger? Start by satisfying his hunger, and then with what is left, you may adorn the altar as well.
You can really see why his writings are so popular. I mean, this is pretty powerful stuff.
Right, and we have hundreds of his sermons as well as some of his biblical commentaries, and it's all like this. Right? It's all like this. Well, while he's in Constantinople, he's living simply instead of lavishly. And by this time, I'm afraid he's kind of expected to live lavishly. So that made him popular with the poor, but it irritated the powerful and other clergy. And while he's there, he also founded several hospitals. The first banishment in 403 was the result of big city rivalry and plotting against him by the Bishop of Alexandria. John was accused of supporting Origenist views, the teachings of Origen, who'd been dead for, well, let's see now, about 150 years, which some people deemed heretical, although he's not generally considered to be so today.
But why would the Bishop of Alexandria want to plot against him?
Well, even before Constantinople had existed as a city, and remember it's founded by Constantine in 330, Alexandria and Antioch are constantly politicking against one another. And that, even though it's disgraceful to say it, transferred itself into religious mode. So they found reasons to argue with one another on theological grounds. So, for example, anybody who's studied a lot of theology will know that even though both of them come within the bounds of orthodoxy in accepting the deity and the humanity of Jesus, Alexandrian theology emphasized his deity more than his humanity, and Antiochene theology did the opposite. And both of them were plotting to bring down whoever was the Patriarch of Constantinople. So that was just like a constant. But as we saw, he came back from that, but he roused the fury of the Emperor Arcadius and even more of his wife Eudoxia by preaching against extravagancies in feminine dress. And that was taken personally and was probably intended personally. And certainly what was unequivocally personally was his attack on her construction of a statue to herself, which he said was an expression of terrible vanity, and he accused it of being attended by pagan practices of various kinds. And so he was banished again. Now, this painting is from only the 19th century and by an extremely unsympathetic to Chrysostom, that is, French painter, a secularist, showing John denouncing the Empress Aelia Eudoxia. And of course, he's being portrayed there as some kind of ranting mad monk, mad hermit, or something like that. But I tend to view Chrysostom as a tragic figure because he embraces most of the changes that have happened up to his own time in Christianity, right? Including the high sacramentalism, the hierarchy in the church, and yet he still wants to cling on to the traditional Christian view of the relationship of the church to society. And of course, it just won't work. And he's a victim of his own possibly naivety. Here's an example of this. He's hanging on to the traditional view, to something that by his own time is simply not true, even though it should be true. He should be right, but by his time he's not. There, he says, secular government, everything is done through fear and constraint. He's not criticizing that. That's the way secular government has to be. Here, in the church, through free choice and liberty. Christians, more than all people, are not allowed to correct by force the faults of those who sin. Secular judges, indeed, when they've captured wrongdoers under the law, demonstrate that their authority is great by preventing them, even against their own will, from following their own desires. But in our case, in the church, the wrongdoer must be corrected not by force, but by persuasion. For neither has the authority of this kind to restrain sinners been given to us by law, nor, if it had been given, should we have any place to exercise our power, since God rewards those who abstain from evil out of their own choice, and not out of necessity. Well, there's the voice of traditional Christianity. But he's saying this in an age where the church, and certainly his own position, is totally enmeshed in high politics. And he ends up paying the price for that by being dismissed and banished into the wilderness, where in fact he dies shortly afterwards. So here's a mosaic of John Chrysostom in the nave of the Hagia Sophia in Constantinople. Of course, that didn't exist in its current form in his own time. That's built under Justinian in the middle of the 6th century. But he's commemorated there because, as I've said, he is extremely important in Eastern Orthodoxy.
So it seems like this episode and the last kind of gave us some chronological overview of what's sort of been happening in the early church. And then starting with next week, we're actually going to get into some of the differences in doctrine and ideas.
Right, yes. Next week's episode is going to be called, excitingly, Augustine and Sex. Augustine, we've already name-checked him a couple of times today, has more influence in the West, at least, not in the East, on how Christians think, even today. And he is theologizing a whole load of these changes. So we're going to have a look at his biography, but also how Christians were thinking or starting to think differently about something as fundamental as sex. And we're going to go on to look at what he has to say in a whole load of other areas in subsequent weeks. So yeah, that's what's coming up now.
So those of us who have taken your classes in the past, we can expect a good dressing down of Augustine.
Yes, yeah, maybe that's not the phrase to use when the word like sex is in the title, but yes. So nothing literal here. We're falling back on Oregonist uses of language, but yes. And then we're going to be pursuing that point or related points in following weeks. So stay with us, people. If you like this, please do repost it to whatever social media you bless with your presence. And we'll look forward to seeing you again soon.
See you next week. Bye, everyone.